Welcome back to History and Politics Chat on Tuesday, October 27th-ish. This is, of course, a week before the 2020 presidential election. And a lot of you had questions about that today. So let's get right to it. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these chats. So I'm going to start in a funny place today, although I don't think it'll surprise anybody knowing that you do know me by now. And that is that a lot of people are stressed out. A lot of people are unable to sleep. We have, on top of the pressure of the election, we have the pressure of the pandemic spiking again, and we're about to go back to, or forward to, I don't know what it is, whichever the time change is in the fall, that's going to make it darker for most people in America. And so I'm going to start today by saying your mental health is in trouble, basically all of us, because of where this country is right now. And please take that seriously. So, I'm sorry, I didn't even mention the natural disasters out west, the fires, people losing their homes. So please be aware that your mental health is in danger and that you need to have some sort of a plan for care of your whole self, physical as well as mental, and to get help from friends and from professionals to the degree you need it. But even if you're sitting there saying, oh, I've never had a problem, I'll be fine, make a plan so that you have a reason to get out of bed in the morning. But just so that you have something to do every day to make yourself feel like the world continues to move forward. And this is a pep talk, by the way, I often give to my graduate students, especially as they're coming toward the end of their dissertations, because that's a very bleak time for a lot of people. It's kind of, I joke, but not really, it's kind of a time of postpartum depression. And I actually tell them to make a list of things that they want to accomplish and make sure that you check one off every day. Reading a chapter in a book, cleaning the bathroom, doing your holiday shopping, painting a picture, something, so trying a new recipe, something so that that day becomes different than the day before it. Now, I am not a mental health care professional, and I urge you, if you need a mental health care professional, to make sure that you do take care of yourself and do that. But I'm just a concerned person who's 58 years old and have seen a lot of students and a lot of friends go through some transition times that it just seems like it wouldn't be a bad idea to have somebody remind you to go ahead and have a plan going forward, because this week's really going to knock off a lot of stuff. And then we've got the pandemic, and then we've got the fires, and then we've got the daylight savings time change. It's going to be a rough ride for a lot of people. And if you're having a hard time with it, I promise you, you are not alone. All right, so that's my first pep talk. All right, so let me go, and there's a bunch of stuff I want to get to today, and I kind of have a little bee in my bonnet about originalism in case you hadn't noticed lately. But let me start here with a question that Jean Finnan asked. And she said, how do polls work? Because, and again, once again, when I tell you what people write, they sound much smarter than I put them. I'm not saying their words exactly, which are much smarter than the way I put them. She says, my husband and I don't ever answer the phone if we don't recognize the number. We're both in our 70s, and no young people answer their phone at all. They just simply text. So how on earth do polls work? And that's a really great question. And I want to add to that why polls are important. So we've all done that, right? You don't ever answer the phone for polls any longer. So the pollsters know that. The people who do polls know that. And polls, let me step back and say polls are, 50 to 70 years old, professional polls. Gallup is one of the first, comes in the 1950s, I think, is when Gallup really takes off. And they have a bunch of methods for sampling people. And those methods have changed over the years, and they're very aware that not everybody answers their phone. So they have a number of different ways to try and contact people. There's phones for sure, and cell phones. There's also opt-in polls, so you can volunteer to do something. Sometimes they write to you and ask if they can set up times to talk to you. They have all kinds of ways of sampling sampling the waters, the political waters around them. Now, interestingly enough, of course, that's quite different than commercial advertising firms do it. And that's way, way, way more accurate. And I've talked about that before, and maybe someday will again if anybody's interested. But so they do have these means of taking the water. But that being said, taking the temperature of the water. But that being said, there are very reputable polls, which are really trying to provide a basic service about what politics are doing. And then there are partisan polls. And what they're doing is they're trying to put their finger on the scale to convince you that something's happening in a different direction than it is. So a lot of what goes on with polling in general in the whole field is actually itself kind of a political game. So there's a lot of polls that you don't have to take seriously at all. And one of the good things to do if you're interested in polls is to look at the aggregators, because the people like at the New York Times or at I can see the number and I can't say it, 538, some of the more reputable aggregators will say, listen, we don't look at this poll because they're only sampling, I don't know, professional wrestlers. I don't know, whatever. But but they will say, we don't think the methodology of this one tells us anything interesting. And you can see there are always polls that are sort of all bunched together, and there's one that's just crazy tunes out there. So looking at aggregators helps you to see which are the reputable polls and which ones are just trying to put their finger on political buttons. So, for example, when Donald Trump tweeted after the last debate that he had won the debate and 92% of people thought he'd won the debate. Well, that was, that was a very much people writing into him, and it wasn't a real poll at all. Whereas CNN, and there were 3 or 4 that did instant polls afterward, and all of them showed Joe Biden winning that poll among watchers by, pretty much the same numbers. I don't remember what they were. And this was very interesting to me because I would have personally, my take was really different than the pollsters had. But that's obviously why they do things, and they weight them. They say, I can do a poll of 4 older college-educated women and 2 young guys in high school. And mathematically, obviously, I want to weight those differently according to how much they are representative of the population. And they do all that. It's really complicated. They have all their formulas and all that. So that's what they do. They go ahead and they get a picture of how people are thinking about politics. But there's some really important pieces to that. And one of those pieces is that pollsters are extremely good about telling you what people are thinking. Like they're really very, very accurate about saying this is the general sentiment of what is happening in the country right now. But the popular sense is not, of course, the electoral vote. And it's much harder for them to be able to say this is how the electoral vote is going to look because, swings of just a little bit, which are in their margin of error, mean a huge swing for one candidate or another. So just because somebody is way up or way down in the polls does not mean they are going to win or lose the election. Also, the thing that pollsters can't tell you is how many people are actually going to show up and vote. So let me give you a little bit of a caveat there. Pollsters can tell you how people are thinking about the election. They can even tell you who is likely to vote. But like this year, with COVID spiking and all of a sudden people voting ahead of time, who on earth is going to show up to vote on election day? And who's going to say at the end of the day they ought to just stay home? No one knows. So they can make really good guesses, but they just don't know. So the pollsters can often end up being wrong based on just the fact of, you get a hurricane in South Carolina on the day of the election, not that's forecast now, that's an example I'm using. The turnout's going to be really different than if you don't. And that's a kind of a wild card that gets inserted to make pollsters look like they're not accurate, when in fact, the real ones really are quite accurate. Now, why do we need them? In a way, like if they can't tell us how it's going to come out, which of course we all want to know, why do we need them at all? because one of the things that pollsters do is they really do give you a snapshot of what the country wants and what the country is thinking, and that it's not shown by the election when we have this electoral college. So if you really want to know what people are thinking about the political scene nowadays, you want the polls. You want them to be able to say, hey, this particular policy is really popular and this one is not, because it's not necessarily going to be reflected in our political system. So in the time of a national election, you definitely want pollsters to say, hey, this is the way things are running. And you also want them for various issues. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. But we know, for example, that a vast majority of Americans want abortion to be safe and legal and rare. And they argue around the edges of what that looks like. But the legality of abortion is enormously popular. So is gun control. Again, we argue about what that looks like, but it is enormously popular. And again, you would not know that if you were only looking at the rhetoric, the way it plays out in the media and in Congress nowadays. So pollsters actually are a really important snapshot of what America looks like in a given moment. So I hope that answered that question. And again, if you're interested, many outlets now do aggregates, and they will tell you why they're including certain people and why they're not. And one of the things you want to look for when you're looking to see if a poll seems accurate is to see if it's transparent, if it tells you who they've polled and why and what their numbers look like. You're much better off than if they say, oh, this is the answer, especially if this being the answer is a long way off. You will see that the polls in this election are really quite solid. And, one of the things that people are horrified by is 2016 looked pretty solid too. What happened, and on and on and on. Well, what the pollsters did not get in 2016 was that there were a lot of undecideds, and the undecideds normally break, fairly evenly. But in 2016, because of the Comey letter, the James Comey letter that dropped, I believe, on October 26th, I believe, a lot of people a lot of the undecideds broke in the end for Trump. And that is why political scientists blame the Comey letter on swinging the election to Donald Trump from Hillary Clinton. And that's why, again, we could spin that out, why the Department of Justice is not supposed to announce an investigation close to the election. We could talk about why Comey did it. There's a reason for why he did it and all that. But so pollsters miss that late breaking stuff. But we are now so close to that election, it's going to be difficult. I shouldn't even say that, but there was an attempt for a similar October surprise at about the same time that that laptop crap, and it just didn't take off because we've been there, done that. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And I think people were like, oh, come on. All right. So that's what's up with the polls. All right. Next question. Kelly, let me see, is that the one I want to do next? Yeah. Kelly Crew Rizzo said, the Associated Press, the AP makes the official call for the presidential race the night of the presidency. Is that correct? And she says she's wondering what happens if Fox says one thing and other news outlets say something different. So this is going to be an interesting year, because remember that the election is not over. There is not a winner until the results are certified. And that certification is in 0 states, is that certification the night of. So some take days, some take weeks, because they need to count everything and they got to go through the challenges and they got to work things through. We all think we know the answer, but there isn't actually an answer to who won an election officially for quite a while. All right, so that's the first caveat. The second is that this election is going to be a weird one for America, because so much of it is happening ahead of time. In many states, you can't count the ballots ahead of time, but it's also happening with mail-in ballots. So that's going to take more time to count. So this idea that we have to have a decision the night of is really about the media. The media invented that because it's exciting and they've got their ticker and they've got, I don't know if they still do it because I don't actually watch TV. I stream everything now. But remember when they had the little horses running across the screen? That's because this is the kind of drama that television is made for. You're up, you're down. So with, and frankly, I mean, I always love watching that stuff myself, but they want there to be an answer. They don't want to go all through that and go, and we'll come back tomorrow. Oh, and we'll come back tomorrow. Oh, and we'll come back tomorrow. So they have pressed people to announce a decision quickly. And that, I think we can virtually assume, is not going to happen this year. I don't know what the television studios are thinking about doing to fill up that time, but we should expect that that's not going to happen. So when you see television stations calling an election for somebody, with the exception of the Associated Press, the AP, and I'm going to pull them out and talk about them in a minute. When a station says, oh, it looks like so-and-so has won, they're doing exit predictions. They're saying we got this many people in and it really looks like, the Democratic candidate is ahead because the only ballots that are still out are these two cities and they're going to come back 72% Democratic. Again, I'm making all this up, but they can say, basically, she's got it. She's won this one. That's not official. That's a projection. And that says so on the screen. They'll say, we project that so-and-so is going to win, but we could be wrong is the subtext of that. The AP does something slightly different, and I'm not going to go into the how they draw their information. It's different than the way news channels do. But the AP will call a race when it is no longer possible. There is no route by which the other candidate can win. So they're not projecting, saying, it's likely he's going to get this many votes here and this many votes here. They are saying, even if the Republican candidate gets every single vote that is left out there, he still can't win. So it's a slightly different way of looking at things, and that's why the AP is supposed to be the gold standard for whether or not somebody has won an election. Now, the question that Kelly asked, though, is what is going to happen if Fox says one thing and everybody else says the opposite? So here's what I would be prepared for in this election. I would be prepared for Donald Trump to come out early and say he has won, regardless of what the anything says. And I say that for two reasons. I say that, first of all, because he has a political interest in convincing people that if the Democrats win, the election has been illegitimate. And that's something that I hoped I remember to play out here. But if you have been watching him, he has gotten phenomenally erratic ever since he had COVID. And people are perhaps associating that with steroid use for the drugs. For the illness. I don't know, but he is, and again, he has been erratic for a long time. And mind you, if you look at old clips of him, he's not. You might not like what he says or anything, but he can carry on a conversation. He makes sense. He has not been well, I would say, for a while. But since his COVID diagnosis, he has been unbelievably erratic. And he has been saying things that are just wildly untrue. And they're so wildly untrue that they really kind of appear delusional. And the example that jumps to mind here for me is that, during the last debate with Democratic candidate Joe Biden, he said that under Obama's refugee program, that only 1% of people who came into the country and were advised of their rights and catch and release. I hate that because it sounds like people are fish. But he said only 1% of them ever came back for their court hearings. The actual number, and it is not a secret number, it's like I know it, and I don't study this stuff except as a historian, is over 99%. And that's not like getting it a little bit off. That's like, you could say, only 90% of people show up, and that would have been a good political point. It would have been wrong, but you could see it being believable. But he goes 1% when it's actually 99%. And they've been really, as I've written about a lot, this campaign has tried to create a false reality. And I think that we need to be prepared for that false reality to continue into the night of the election, because they are constructing things that aren't real. I mean, one of the things that's interesting today in the news, and there has not been a lot new in the news today, the big news remains the Supreme Court. Apparently a number of weeks ago, not couldn't have been that long ago because the encyclical wasn't that long ago, but you may or may not know that the Pope did a very important encyclical in which he basically said the world needs to go back to caring for each other. I mean, didn't explicitly mention the American Republican Party by name, but it was pretty clear that the Pope was taking a stand against right-wing political parties in the world right now. And Joe Biden was talking about what the Pope said. It's a long encyclical. I read it. It's really worth reading. Really worth reading. But Biden was talking about what the Pope said, and in it, the Pope said things like, "What is why am I here?" The sort of things that Jesuits, because the Pope is a Jesuit, ask. And the Trump campaign pulled out Biden talking about that and tried to imply that he's still going with this "the man is demented" argument or has dementia argument. And so he pulled it out, and he's tried to create this ad where Biden theoretically looks like he's addled. And that's happened again and again and again. Somebody actually recently sent me something that had been very badly cut, and it made it sound as if Biden was backing something called a land bank and or a farm bank. And I wrote back and I said, I have no idea what this is. I mean, and I actually know a lot about agricultural policy. So I'm like, we have had the concept of land banks, but that was in the 1890s. I don't get this. And finally, and I said, the only thing I know about is that farm bankruptcies are, and I went, that's it. They took one of Biden's speeches about farm bankruptcies being over the moon under this administration and cut it in such a way, it made it sound like he was talking about a farm bank. And, people were responding to that going, the man's a lunatic. Well, yeah. But anyway, so I think we have to expect that Trump is going to go ahead and try and create a false reality where he comes out and he says, I won, here's my second term, everything's going to be great. When in fact, no election has been called. So I think we have to be prepared for that happening. And one of the reasons that I say this, and one of the reasons that I think it's really important to keep hammering on this, is that this election is not over until the votes are called. No matter what the Fox News channel says, no matter what Sean Hannity says, no matter what the president or Attorney General William Barr says. And I think they really are hoping to create this world, this vision where people think they have won, and somehow that is being flipped or overturned, when in fact all it is the actual counting. And I think it's really important that Americans get that into their heads, that until there is actually certified results of the election is not over, no matter what anybody says. I mean, actually, if we can do it that way, I'm declaring the election over right now, and we can all go home happy. But I have no more authority to do that than Donald Trump does. He does not have the authority to call the election. He does not have the authority to call the election. That goes down to the states and the certification of the results of that election. All right. I can see here, somebody just said Trump is claiming he's up in all these states. He is, in fact, claiming he's up in all sorts of states that he is losing, at least according to the polls, that he is down in significantly. All right, so that brings up something else that somebody asked. And now I can't find the question. I wanted to use your name. And now I can't remember what the question was. Sorry about that. Polling, whether it's, somebody asked, is it in fact possible to recall your ballot after you have cast it, as Trump is suggesting people are wanting to do, and he is implying, especially in Florida, that people want to recall their ballot to write him in instead of Joe Biden. In many states, yes, it is possible. It is not very common, but in many states it is possible. And yes, on Google, and this is a talk about creating your own reality. On Google, the numbers of people Googling, can I change my ballot, has spiked dramatically since Trump said that. Well, here's a newsflash. I personally have Googled it 3 times, so I could talk about it here. I'm sure people are just Googling it to figure out what on earth he's talking about. I personally don't know anybody who has ever changed a ballot. So that's anecdotal, and the plural of anecdote is not data, I know. But how many people do you know who have gone and changed their ballot after they have already cast it? What he's trying to do there is make a political statement that, in fact, he is more popular than and that people think, and that he's got this growing wave. In fact, the reality appears to be the opposite. Undecided voters, the few undecided voters that are there, appear to be breaking for Biden, not for Trump. And I think the answer to that is precisely what Trump is trying so hard not to talk about, and that's COVID. You know, again, today the White House came out and said that one of his great triumphs is he stopped the coronavirus pandemic, that he solved it, that it's over, and we are literally the rate of infections is the highest it has ever been, including in the early days of the pandemic. Now, that being said, deaths right now are not at that same spiking level for 2 reasons. One, because this spike in infections is going to have a death lag, but second of all, because we do know better now how to care for people with COVID-19. But so this idea that somehow it's all over and everything's great, that again is simply delusional. And so anyway, going back to whether or not you can change your vote, yes, in some states, not in all states, and it's a little bit cumbersome. But that doesn't mean you get to vote twice. Just so you know, if you it's called spoiling a ballot, and they literally have to pull one ballot and destroy it before you can vote again. So that is possible. But check, if you're interested in doing that, check your state and see if you're one of the states that can do it. I think I read. I shouldn't even say this. I think it's about half the states, but I can't remember which. All right. Somebody also is talking about Trump talking about millions of people going to vote. There's a narrative going on here where, of course, we know there's been massive early voting and mail-in voting, and that it appears to be running heavily Democratic. So the Republican take on that is that Trump voters are going to show up to vote on the day of the election, which looks like it's probably going to be true. But again, back to the hole in the polling, what do these COVID spikes say about that? I mean, you've got these terrible hot spots, especially across the Midwest. Are people really going to go out and vote in person? I mean, the irony of this is that it was the Republicans who didn't want there to be mail-in voting, wanted people to show up to vote, because they thought that it was going to be fine in red states when that happened. And of course, it's the opposite now. So we'll see how this plays out. Lots of wild cards this year. All right. So I want to talk about something now that is going to sweep in a lot of things that, I'm sorry, there's one I want to answer. I'm not sure I'm going to get to it. Somebody said, is Trump the worst president ever, and who else is a competitor? And I can't tell you how much I would love to answer that, but I want to get to something else. Maybe I'll do that in History Chat if I don't have time for it today. And that on Thursday, if I don't have time for it to get today. And that was that I do want to talk again about the Supreme Court and what that means. And the reason that I want to talk about it again is that the Supreme Court's important for sure. But for me personally, I did not understand all of the stuff about Robert Bork and Clarence Thomas and what are they fighting about and what is originalism and what is legislating from the bench and what about incorporation. And I found for many years that it was kind of this black box that I couldn't work my way into. So I got really obsessed with it, as you can probably tell, over the last several days. But that's not new. I mean, I've done a lot with court cases. And I certainly had read up a lot. I mean, like the law review stuff on incorporation, and it just didn't make sense to me. Which I think, by the way, is a sign of being able to absorb stuff when you're ready for it. Because now I look at it and I think this was hard. It makes total sense to me now. And I think it's just my brain wasn't ready for it when I was doing it before. Maybe I don't know why. But anyway, so I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on with the Supreme Court and why it's important. And that I want to wrap into a longer discussion from Jessica Colton, who says, I want to know about women's rights. Why hasn't the ERA been ratified? How far could the Supreme Court go in undermining the ground women have gained in the last 50 years? Grace Chesley wants to know, what about the Supreme Court overriding states' decisions about ballots and election cutoff dates? Somebody else wanted to know, I'm sorry, it was Phyllis Sack who wanted to know about several states allowing someone to change their vote. People want to know a number of things about the present. How did the Republican Party get to the point that it was willing to pull something like it pulled last night with the confirmation of Amy Barrett? And finally, Ann Elizabeth asked quite pithily, how the hell did we get here? And I want to give you a little bit of a picture of how the hell we got here and what the bigger story is and how the Supreme Court fits into that, because it's a really interesting story, but it also leads to where I'm hoping to go. And for me anyway, it brings the concept of the Supreme Court and why we care about it into human terms that I actually understand. So if you've been confused about it, this is probably the question for you, the answer for you. All right. So how did we get here? And what is going on with the Supreme Court? I want to start back, and I'm sorry to do this to you, but I got to start back in the 1920s. I'm going to start back in the 1920s because the 1920s were a really special era in America politically. And what I mean by that is that the election of 1920 was a landslide election. And it was because it was a landslide election coming off of World War I and the Democrats being in charge of the White House and the Congress during World War I. Because of that landslide 1920 election, the Republican Party took control of the White House and all of Congress for the first time since 1875. All right, so when that happened, and the party had changed a lot between 1874 and in 1921, when everyone's going to take office in the Republican Party. And what they had done is they had become a very pro-business party, and they had come to believe that the problem with America in the 1890s, the extremes of wealth and poverty and, children having to work in the streets and all that kind of stuff. The reason that things were so bad was because the Republican Party had never been able to put its own policies in place. Because every time it really wanted to do something, the freaking Democrats came in and said, you can't do that. And they insisted on regulating business, for example. Or talking about an income tax, all these things that the pro-business Republicans thought was actually destroying the country. So with the landslide election of 1920 and the installment of the Republican Party in control of all the branches of the government in 1921, what happens is there is a complete wedding, if you will, of Republican pro-business policies and the government. And this is, of course, going to happen under Warren Gamaliel Harding, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge after Harding dies, and then Herbert Hoover after Coolidge steps down, not steps down in the next election when he can't run. Well, he can run, but just bear with me here. Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. Hoover's 1928, and literally, if you think about the 1920s, the 1920s looked like, the best thing since sliced bread, if you didn't look too deeply. You had new magazines, you had refrigerators, you had cars, you had railroads, you had silk stockings for women, you had, glossy magazines, you had new fashions, you had new art, you had, did I say cars? You had movies, you had, you name it, you had it. And it looked like this was going to be the answer to not just America, but to humanity. Because literally during the 1920s, People believe you're not going to need to have reform organizations any longer. You're not going to need to help the poor any longer because there aren't going to be any poor any longer because the Republicans have figured it out. And what they figured out was to turn the government over to business. And they argued that businessmen were the only ones who understood how the economy worked and therefore how society worked, and that America had finally come up with the perfect system. And you can see that with things like the publication of The Man Nobody Knows, which was a book about Jesus. And Jesus was the head of a corporation who took 12 unknown men from, who pulled them up from poverty and turned them into the most powerful corporation on earth. Literally, I am not making that up. That was a book. It was a best-selling book in the 1920s. So I hold that up there because that's going to be important in just a minute. So what happens is Herbert Hoover is elected in 1928, and he literally gives an inaugural address where he says, our only issue here in America now is eradicating poverty entirely, because everybody's just going to be, walking on water after. And we shouldn't have said that in relation to Jesus, but everything's going to be just great because we've nailed it here. Everything's going to be great. And look at the stock market. Look how well that's doing. Although actually Hoover was a little bit worried about that. But the reason I set that up is, of course, he's inaugurated in March in 1929. And of course, the bottom falls out of everything in October of 1929. And what that does is the Republican Party has completely doubled down on this idea that they're the only ones who know how to run the economy. They've got this perfect system. And the Democrats should have no role in anything. And the entire bottom falls out. And that's the Great Depression. People are, farmers are pouring their milk into the road because they can't afford to take it to market. People are starving. There's no work. Literally, people are trying to feed each other. I mean, people are committing suicide. It is one of the all-time worst periods in American history. Mind you, our textbooks will say the same thing about this period in which we are living. Going back to the mental health thing, if you're having a hard time with it, understand that your grandchildren and great-grandchildren will read about this era and say, how did they ever live through it? The same way we said about people who lived through the Depression. Anyway, so the bottom falls out of everything, and the Democrats under Franklin Delano Roosevelt come in, and Roosevelt says to the voters, he says, I'm going to promise you a new deal. You need a new deal. The government has worked just to protect big business. And now that the bottom's fallen out, look, it turns out they were all corrupt. And it is. I mean, it turns out they've been cheating on the stock market, and they've been doing all kinds of shenanigans because there's no regulation, nothing to stop them from behaving that way. So under FDR and the New Deal, America gets a new kind of government. And it's a government that harks back to the progressive government of Teddy Roosevelt and also to the government of Abraham Lincoln, which also used the government in order to protect ordinary Americans, although it did so in a different way than FDR did. And that FDR government does three things. It regulates business so they can't, and finance, so they can't pull the kind of crap that created the Great Crash. It provides a basic social safety net so that people can get work for the government if they can't find work because the entire economy has fallen apart. And it also provides food for people who are starving, and it provides Social Security, which is an old age benefit program designed by Francis Perkins, which is itself an interesting story that I won't go into here because I want to get forward. And it also promotes infrastructure to go ahead and use the federal government to enable all Americans to enter into the 20th century and to have access to the kinds of resources that they're going to need to have in order to be productive members of society, like electricity. I mean, you can't very well be an efficient farmer in Tennessee if you don't have access to the agricultural bulletins, for example, that are coming over the radio. So they do the government does these things. And at the same time as it's regulating business, it also is is managing to make these things happen, through the use of taxes. Now, as this is happening, the Democratic Party thinks this is a great idea, although not all of them are real keen on FDR, let me tell you. But the Republican Party, for the most part, is horrified. But not everybody. A lot of the Republicans are like, you're right. We really went way too far, and we need to to accept the kind of changes that the Democrats are doing. We need to regulate business, and we need a basic social safety net, and we need to promote infrastructure. We just think we can do a better job than the Democrats do. And the people who argue that become known as the Dewey Republicans. If you've heard of Dewey in the 1930s and the 1940s, Thomas E. Dewey is the leader of that branch of the Republican Party. But there is a group in the Republican Party who want no part of this. They are Hoover Republicans. They think that FDR is a revolutionary radical and that he needs to be stopped, and that essentially America is becoming a socialist country. And the way they get there is not ever, and this, I'm actually thinking about writing about this tonight, it's not ever because the government under FDR is talking about true socialism, which is a system by which the government owns the means of production. So literally that would mean we would go to government hospitals. Now, of course, we don't. We go to private hospitals or to charitable hospitals or to university hospitals, but the government would literally own the hospitals. The government would literally own the railroads and the mines and the factories. That's what socialism is, and nobody ever suggested that in American history, basically. And there's a little bit of a caveat in that, but I'm not going to go into it today. But they insist that he is a socialist because they are drawing from the history of Reconstruction, when reactionary white Southerners turn against the idea of black voting by saying, hey, listen, we don't mind that they're black. Of course they do. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments say that you can't discriminate based on race or previous condition of servitude. We care that they're poor people, and they're voting for policies that are going to cost tax dollars. And those tax dollars are going to have to be paid for by people who have property. And by definition, that's people like us, that is, white men. And they begin to argue that the idea that ordinary Americans vote is itself socialism. It's a very American term, that version of socialism. It is not world socialism. But the Hoover Republicans say that it is. And one of the people who emerges as the leader of the Hoover Republicans is a guy named Robert Taft. I'm sorry, I couldn't come up with his first name. He's William Howard Taft's son. He's a senator from Ohio. And Robert Taft is dead set against the New Deal. He is dead set against this new kind of government. And he firmly believes after the war that he's going to be the leader of the Republican Party, and they're going to take the country back to the way it looked in the 1920s. And he used to work for Hoover, so that you can see this lineage straight through. And he's all set to do that when he expects that he is going to be the nominee for president in 1952 for the Republican Party, when out of the blue, Dwight Eisenhower fights him for the nomination. And Eisenhower fights him for the nomination because Taft is also an isolationist. He does not want to participate in NATO. And Eisenhower does want to participate in NATO because he's terrified that if the Western world doesn't pull together, it's going to have to face the rise of authoritarian governments, communist governments, but also fascist governments. He's against both of them. Should never forget that Eisenhower was first an anti-fascist. Never thought about him as being Antifa, but he was. As well as being anti-communist, which is how we remember him now. But he was also anti-fascist. He fought someone, the Nazis. But so Eisenhower goes ahead and he runs for that nomination on the same terms that FDR and Truman had talked about the government. Yes, the government should regulate business. It should provide a basic social safety net, and it should promote infrastructure. So now you've got both the Democrats and the Republicans arguing for the same kind of a government. And Eisenhower wins. And Eisenhower is enormously popular. And he basically tries to create this new government, tries to advance this new government to try and make sure that all Americans get to have equal opportunity, equal access to resources, and equality before the law. This drives the Taft people over the edge, because now it's not just the Democrats, it's also all the Republicans, and they're this little tiny group. And they keep saying, you can't do this. We have to go back to the government of the 1920s. It does nothing but protect big business. And everyone else is like, you guys are on drugs, because we love our cars. We love our new houses. You know, under you guys, we lived in a depression. Under Eisenhower, you know, we've got a GNP to die for here. So why would we want to go back to what you're talking about? And I'm not sick, by the way. I had popcorn just before I sat down here. I'm still choking on it. And they can't get any traction. So, and they don't manage to get any traction until something happens. And what happens is this. FDR and the Democrats push through all the New Deal legislation through the Congress, but because they need Democratic votes to do it, that legislation is really not going to challenge the racial status quo in America, because Democrats in this era have not yet switched sides, and Democrats are virulently racist. They need those Southern Democrats in order to get New Deal laws through Congress. So under Eisenhower, a Republican, he looks at the Supreme Court, and he also looks at the racial disparities in the country, and he says, we can't have this. We can't have this on moral grounds. Remember, had been the commander-in-chief of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, and he knew that his black soldiers and Mexican soldiers and Native soldiers and Asian soldiers had fought just as, and Polish soldiers had fought just as hard as white soldiers. So he opposes it on moral grounds. He opposes it as somebody who has overseen the military. But he also recognizes that America's racial hierarchies are unbelievable food for fodder for communist governments, because they sit there and say, oh yeah, right, American democracy, look how they're treating the black guys over there. And he recognizes that this is a huge propaganda problem for America. So he does a number of things, but one of the things that he does is he goes ahead and he puts at the head of the Supreme Court the former Republican governor of California, a man named Earl Warren. And Earl Warren had been in California during the Lemon Grove incident. And the Lemon Grove incident is a fascinating moment in American history where Mexican parents challenged the separate but equal doctrine in California, saying that their children deserved equal resources as the white children. And the courts the California courts decided that case in their favor. Way too few people know about the Lemon Grove incident. It's a really, really interesting case. I urge you to read about it if you're so inclined. And it's really the precursor to Brown versus Board of Education. And so Eisenhower knew that Warren was up to speed on Lemon Grove. And when Warren comes onto the Supreme Court, and mind you, had been a politician, so he understands how to create coalitions and all that. One of the early things he does, one of the first things he does, is he creates or puts through the court the unanimous decision overseen by a Republican justice called Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. And that is a decision that overturns Plessy v. Ferguson, which is the 1896 law that says that it's okay to discriminate against African Americans. Separate but equal is okay. And he says, no, it's not. Now that's really important because he's overturning another Supreme Court decision. How does he do it? All right, so this is now we're getting into the whole point of the court. He does it by taking a look at the Constitution and the laws, and by saying the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, written by Congress in 1866 and ratified by the states in 1868, has a due process clause. And that due process clause, it also has it is the second of the two amendments to the Constitution that expand the power of the federal government rather than contracting it. Until the 13th Amendment, every amendment had either been instructionary or had limited what the federal government could do. But he says, let's look at the 14th. He and the other justices let's look at the 14th. You can reach in through the 14th Amendment, this post-Civil War amendment. You can reach in through that and grab the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, pull them out and make the states live by them. So the Bill of Rights in the Constitution applies to the federal government. That was the conditions under which the Anti-Federalists said that they were going to go ahead and sign onto the Constitution. So we get those 10 amendments. But by pulling them through the 14th, what the Warren Court does is it says states must adhere to these rights. They have to, it's not just the federal government that can't impinge on your speech or your religion or your, right of assembly or any of the many things that are protected. The states can do that too. So if your state screws around with you, you can go to the federal government, and they're going to have to stop doing that by us reaching through the 14th. And the other thing they do, and they do this in tandem with the Congress, is they go ahead and they protect voting rights. They say, states can't discriminate against voting rights. And so the Congress gives us the Voting Rights Act, at the 65 Voting Rights Act, at the same time that the Supreme Court says, hey, stop with the districts where you have 500 people in one and 100,000 in the other. That's illegal. One person, one vote. All right. So the people who don't like that, they don't like this new government that regulates business and raises taxes for a basic social safety net, now take a look at the fact that the Supreme Court is protecting minority rights in the states, especially Black rights in this period. And they say, oh, wait a minute, we're totally done with this. And what happens is those Taft Republicans use Brown versus Board of Education to say, see, we told you this whole new government was just a form of communism. And look, it's giving Black people white people's money, basically, is what they're saying. So this momentum, they could not get momentum under Eisenhower, where, by the way, the highest tax bracket was 91%. So this whole, every time I have a family member who every time he's totally pro-Trump. It's like, I want to go back to the 1950s. I'm like, great, me too. Let's start with the 91% tax bracket. And that conversation really never goes much further than that. Anyway, that was an aside I should probably not have said. But anyway, so then they didn't get anywhere with that. But once they throw race into the mix, they really have the ticket. And they really push on this idea, and you can see this idea of, in 1954, there's a famous book that comes out called McCarthy and His Enemies, in which William F. Buckley Jr. and his brother-in-law L. Brent Bazell divide the world into capital L liberals, and that's all the Republicans and Democrats both who want to use the government the way the New Deal and Eisenhower did, and they stand against capital C conservatives, who are not conservative at all. They're radicals. They want to overturn this government that works, and they say so in the book. But they call themselves conservatives, who are the only ones holding on to true American values. And this is the birth of what has become known as movement conservatism. It has now taken over the Republican Party, but in the early years, Republicans looked at these guys and they're like, "You guys are bonkers." There's a history of the Republican Party that's written in the 60s. Doesn't even mention them. They're like some fringe wacko group. So the movement conservatives begin to pick up steam by harnessing racism to their opposition to that New Deal government, and increasingly, as the Supreme Court uses that trick of going through the 14th and making sure the states pay attention to the Bill of Rights and to voting rights, they add to their complaints social complaints and religious complaints. And it's important to remember here, I think, that after the Warren Court, you get the Warren Burger Court. Warren Burger is another Republican. He is appointed by Richard Nixon, and it is under him, a Republican, that we get the Roe versus Wade decision. And the Roe v. Wade decision is predicated on the constitutional right to privacy, which is not enumerated in the Constitution. This is a product of them trying to figure out what is in the Constitution. And it is designed to protect women's equal rights. The idea, and that's the terms on which it was argued. I've talked elsewhere about abortion. I don't have time to do it now. I'm happy to do it sometime if you want to know more. So anyway, there is an increasing backlash against the government and what it is doing, and by social traditionalists against the changes in minority rights through this court. And what they begin to say, and I'm going to switch to the court now and not talk about politics because I'm losing time here. What they begin to say is that judges are legislating from the bench. This is activist. These are activist judges who are creating law, and rather than simply doing what the state governments have done, and that they are illegitimately legislating from the bench. And what they mean is you can't do that. You can't make the states live by the 14th Amendment. And the doctrine of doing that, of using the 14th Amendment to pull forward the Bill of Rights, is called incorporation, if you've heard that it incorporates different pieces of the Bill of Rights to different state decisions. All right, so what happens? What happens is that people who are pushing back against those changes team up with big business, basically corporations who don't, and businessmen who don't like taxes, but what they really don't like is business regulation, which is far more valuable to them than worrying terribly about income taxes. But whatever, they're happy to talk about taxes. That's something that's really tangible and that regular people care about. But what they really care about is stripping away the government's ability to regulate business. And they team up together both to take over the political system, which they do under Ronald Reagan, who talks as a movement conservative. He actually doesn't govern like one, but he certainly talks like one. Remember, get rid of big government, the taxes are killing you, I'm all for the little guy, all that stuff is straight out of that 1920s mentality. But then they also realize that they've got to do something about the court. And in 1971, a guy named Lewis Powell goes ahead and writes, he's a lawyer for the tobacco industry, he writes a memo for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in which he says, we've got to get rid of these liberals. And again, by that, somehow that's come to mean Democrat. It doesn't. It means anybody who believes that you need to have an active government to protect individuals, which is the concept of the word liberal. We have to get rid of these people. They, look at everybody's thinking like they do. They're running, the media stations, and they're running universities, and they're running schools, and they're running businesses, and they're running the courts. And we have to get rid of these people by changing the national conversation. Like, how do you think I learned to do this, right? By changing the national conversation. And one of the things he says is we have to take back, we have to have think tanks, he says, and we have to take back college campuses. This is where you get the idea that all colleges are liberal and all professors are liberal. This is from him. We have to take those back, and the media too, the liberal media. That's what that means. It doesn't mean that they're in the tank for the Democrats. It means that they are willing to have a fact-based discussion about what the role of government is. They don't believe government has any role in any of that. So unless you believe with them, you are by definition a liberal. So the other place he wants to take things on is the courts. He wants to use the courts to stop doing what they have been doing. And of course, this is 71, and in 1972, Richard Nixon puts Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court. So one of the doctrines that develops out of that is the doctrine of originalism. And it's got a number of branches. And the three major branches are originalism, textualism, and natural law. And I'm not going to have time now to go into all those things. But what they say is that you can't do that. You can't say, I'm going to read the 14th Amendment backward and make the states behave, because the Constitution itself, when it was written, is the only pure expression of democracy that we have, which, by the way, is completely ahistorical. That's not what happened with the Constitution. But because of that, people like Antonin Scalia argued, you have to start with that, and you can't do anything that is not explicitly enumerated in the Constitution. So what he said initially, or what people said initially, was that you had to take a look at the actual words of the Constitution and what they meant at the time and when it was written in 1787. And that went downhill real quickly because, of course, historians jumped in and said, well, this word actually means this and it has no meaning here. And they said, well, forget that. Then we're going to go with what they meant by it. And that got even messier because, of course, what they meant in that era is really highly contested, especially since all of the people, 57 of them, as I recall, who signed the Constitution, had different ideas about it. And they wrote about those different ideas. So you can have Jefferson saying one thing and Hamilton saying the other. And how are you going to split that baby? By the way, Jefferson didn't write the Constitution. He was in France at the time, but he wrote a lot about it and what he thought it stood for. So you had, how do you go ahead with this? So a great example of that, it comes out to a question that Elizabeth Wing asked. She said, what does it mean when an originalist looks at gun control? And that's a great example because this is a very famous case of the District of Columbia versus Heller. in 2008, as I recall, yes, in which the District of Columbia had banned handguns and had put restrictions on the ownership of guns. And under Scalia, the originalists on the Supreme Court said, no, 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 you can't ban handguns. And they did that by reaching not to what people had actually meant by the Second Amendment, which is pretty clear. They meant that if you were part of a well-regulated militia, you could have handguns. And that, of course, had been hemmed in 1878 and places like that as well. But they said, oh, well, we have to look at what people would have thought was okay in the time of the Constitution. And one of the things they would have said is that a man has a right to self-defense. And therefore, if you read that forward, you can say that nowadays you have to be allowed to have a handgun. Well, that is completely ahistorical. So the point I'm trying to make here is that what they are doing is claiming history to make a political point and to say we don't want any of that, what we consider judicial activism, and instead what we need to do is go back to the original system under which the Constitution went into effect. But here's the real problem. Think of what America looked like in the 1920s. And I keep saying you could do a really interesting intellectual argument for originalism as a defense of democracy. Which is something I'm actually really into right now. And I've actually lay in bed thinking about how you would do that. But the key to that is, if you were going to do that, you would have to guarantee universal voting. The state would have to be on the side of universal voting, because instead what you've got is what we saw last night when the Supreme Court came out and said that the state law in Pennsylvania had to stand even if it meant that votes couldn't be counted if they came in up to 6 days after the election, because it was the state legislature that got to make that call, not the state courts, according to the state constitution of, I'm sorry, Wisconsin. Pennsylvania is a few days before that. I'm sorry, I just got that confused. It's Wisconsin last night. But where's the problem with that? The problem with that is the Wisconsin legislature has cheated so that the Democrats can't ever win it. So what you've got is voter suppression. What they've said is the states can do whatever they want, and therefore minorities, in this case Democrats, who are actually make up a majority, but they're being treated like a minority, they don't really have any rights, because everything comes down to what happens at the state government level. So what's going to happen, and this to go back to the question about women's rights, what's going to happen with Barrett on the court, another originalist, to give them a 6-3 majority. And the reason they needed that is because John Roberts, the Chief Justice John Roberts, is getting kind of cold feet about the illegitimacy of the Supreme Court at this point. It's his Supreme Court, after all. What that's going to mean is that a lot of protections that we have taken for granted, both at the congressional level, business regulation, the Affordable Care Act, Social Security, things that provided a basic social safety net, are now on the chopping block, because those are things that are not enumerated in the original Constitution. But then it goes forward to say, to move forward from the 1930s to the 1950s and the actions of the courts. We are also facing a situation where the court's protection of minority rights is very much at risk, because if you can't do that, if you can't reach through the 14th, and the federal government can't say to a state, no, you can't discriminate against Muslims, for example, or Catholics, or evangelical Christians, pick your denomination, which is the states are not covered by the First Amendment any longer, then the states can do whatever they want. And that's going to turn things really uneven. So Massachusetts, for example, I'm not sure we're going to see a whole lot of changes. But there was already an abortion case coming up through from one of the southern states, I think Mississippi, the minute that Coney Barrett got confirmed. And it's pretty clear that certain state legislatures are going to do things that are not representative of their people, because they're voter suppression in states like Georgia, like Mississippi, like all the states that Stacey Abrams calls the voter suppression states. So that was, I would love to go on and on and on about this, but obviously I've run over already, so I won't do that. But this is why originalism is, to my mind, such a problem, because it will wipe out basically the government we've lived under. if they follow through on it. It means that we are going to take the country back to the sort of government we had in the 1920s, which was run by business. And I don't think that turned out very well, because I look at the crash and the fact that in the 20s, if you were a political minority, an anarchist, a socialist, and mind you, there weren't that many of them, or if you were a person of color, or if you were a woman, or if you, I mean, you really did not have civil rights because you were living under the tyranny of the majority in your state. And this is why this election is so, excuse me, damned important. So one last thing, I know I've run over, but I do want to say, having laid that out, I know people are frightened, terrified. And somebody asked me, said, tell us it's going to be okay. I can't tell you it's going to be okay because I'm a prophet of the past, not of the future. But I can tell you this. What Donald Trump and the Republicans want is for you to think you are not powerful. They want to think it's a done deal. They want you to think that you have to do whatever they say. And the truth is, they know that they are hideously outnumbered. They would not have to gerrymander the states. They would not have to steal elections. They would not have to suppress the vote. They would not have to pack the Supreme Court if they didn't know that there are far more of us than there are of them. And I would urge you not to despair at all, but rather to recognize that the future really does belong to us. And, and when you think about that, and when I know I know everyone's scared, especially since we're all stuck at home and we can't spend time with people that think like us and all that, but we're really powerful. I mean, just the people who follow me on Facebook alone, you're almost up to 1 million people, and you all have family members and friends. That right there is a lot of people, and we're a good community. And here's the news flash. They can, the people who are trying to take America into an oligarchy, which is what I believe they're doing, are powerful people, and they're gaming the system in a lot of ways. It's true, but I promise you, they're not the kind of numbers on their team that there are on those of us who want to see a democracy in which every person is equal before the law, and every person has equality of access to resources and equality of opportunity. That is the American dream. And the guy I learned that from was Abraham Lincoln. And I still gotta believe that that's the vision of America that's gonna take us into the future. All right, thanks for being here. Thursday is gonna bring us 2 days closer to this election. Please get sleep, please eat right, and recognize that no matter what happens next week, the sun is going to rise up again, and there's going to be a new day to change the world again. Thanks for being here.